She took a job cooking for cowboys on a ranch, not knowing one of them owned the very land they stood on. Snow was falling over the Montana plains, a heavy curtain, thick as silence and twice as cold. December had sunk its teeth deep into the land, frosting the brittle grass and clinging to the weathered beams of the Stone River Ranch like an old, familiar sorrow. The wind screamed between the outbuildings, a high, lonely sound that rattled loose shingles and stung any patch of skin foolish enough to face it. May walked straight into that wind. Her coat was too thin, patched at the elbows, and her gloves were a mismatched pair, one wool, one leather. But her spine was straight, and her eyes burned with a fierce defiance that only women with nothing left to lose ever truly master. A satchel banged against her hip, and her worn boots left sharp, deliberate prints in the frozen mud of the ranch yard. She stopped before the cookhouse, where a clutch of cowboys huddled near an open fire, passing a flask and laughing in low rumbles through chattering teeth. They looked up as she approached, the laughter dying one by one as they took in the sight of her, a woman alone, in a place that gave nothing easily. A tall man stepped forward, older than the rest, with a graying beard and suspicion etched into the lines of his brow. His voice was gravel stirred with whiskey. "This is a working ranch, ma'am. No place for strays, and no time for stories." "I'm not a stray," May replied, her voice steady and low. "And I'm not here to tell stories." He looked her over, a long, slow appraisal. "We've got no use for trouble, or liars, or girls who think they can sweet-talk their way out of the cold." May's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to sweet-talk either." Another man, thicker and with a meaner glint in his eye, spat a brown stream of tobacco near her boot. "Looks like she came from a saloon kitchen, if not the back room." A ripple of crude laughter followed. The first man raised a hand, silencing it. He stepped closer until the cold vapor of their breath mingled. "Then what do you want?" May met his stare without blinking. "I can cook," she said, her voice like flint striking steel. "I've worked cast iron over an open fire, skinned game, made sourdough in a snowstorm, and soup from little more than bones and hope. I can feed your men with whatever's left in the barrel and make them say thank you for it." There was a pause broken only by the sharp crackle of the fire. "Where'd you come from?" he asked. May didn't answer. He leaned in closer. "This ain't a place for secrets." She lifted her chin. "I know how to cook, and I'm not turning back." The man studied her a moment longer, then gave a sharp nod and stepped aside, gesturing toward the cookhouse. "We've got 3 dozen men to see through winter, and haven't had a proper meal in 2 days. The stove's in there. You want the job, prove it by morning." May didn't flinch. "I'll need flour, salt, a dry towel, and a little respect wouldn't kill you." He grunted, a sound that was half a laugh. "We'll see about that last part." As May moved toward the door, her eyes swept over the group one last time. Most looked away, some smirked, but one man hadn't moved at all. He leaned against a porch post, arms folded across his chest, tall and broad in a dark coat, a brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. All that was visible was the sharp line of his jaw and the flicker of something unreadable in his gaze as it caught the firelight. He didn't speak, didn't scoff. He just watched. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second too long before May pushed open the cookhouse door and stepped into the cold, dark space. It smelled of stale grease and rust. But in the corner, the great iron stove stood like a promise, and she felt a stubborn flicker of hope stir in her chest. She hung her satchel on a hook, rolled up her sleeves, and began. Outside, the man in the dark coat, Caleb, kept his arms crossed. He had recognized her face before she'd even spoken. He'd seen her once, years ago in Billings, when she worked behind the kitchen doors of the Rose Bell, that painted-up place where decent men whispered indecent things and left their honor at the door. He'd seen her dragged into the main room one night, accused of some petty theft. A man twice her size had her by the wrist. She hadn't screamed or cried. She had just stood there, spine like iron, eyes full of fire, daring the world to strike her down. He had watched from the shadows then, and he had done nothing. Now here she was, with snow in her hair and that same defiance in every line of her body. He said nothing, just turned and walked toward the bunkhouse as the firelight danced behind him. A storm was coming, both outside and in, and it seemed to have her name. May was awake before the moon had surrendered the sky. The cold was a physical thing, seeping into her bones as she pulled on her threadbare coat. Snow had drifted against the cookhouse door, and it took a hard shove of her shoulder to open it. She chipped ice from the water barrel, fed the stove with pine kindling, and worked until the heat began to chase the fog of her breath from the air. Her fingers stung, her back ached, but she moved with the grim efficiency of a woman who had survived far worse. 15 cowboys meant 15 hungry mouths. She worked flour into a stiff dough for biscuits, sliced thick slabs of salt pork, and brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead. The first morning, the men muttered and grumbled. By the third, they were filing in early, scraping their plates clean and passing the coffee pot with a quiet reverence. They offered no praise, but they ate every last crumb. May worked in a world of her own making, cleaning the pans, scrubbing the long table, sweeping ash from the corners. And every morning before the others, Caleb would appear. He never said much. He'd step inside, lift the heavy logs into the firebox without being asked, and leave without ceremony. She would nod her thanks. He would give the barest tip of his hat. He never quite met her eyes. There was a distance in his silence, not of judgment, but of something held back. Something he didn't trust himself to reveal if she looked too long. Yet, he was the one who left an extra bucket of water by the door, who replaced her worn-down sliver of soap with a fresh bar, who quietly fixed the icy step after seeing her slip near the woodpile. It was a strange, wordless kindness, and it was steady. One evening, hauling melted snow across the yard, her boot hit a patch of black ice. She went down hard. The bucket flew, water splashing across the frozen ground. The breath knocked from her lungs. A sharp, white-hot pain shot up her wrist. She hissed, biting her lip against a cry. Before she could move, strong arms were around her. Caleb. He had crossed the yard in seconds. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. His face was close, shadowed by the brim of his hat. His hands were warm and steady through his gloves. She managed a single, shallow nod. "I'm fine." He helped her to her feet, one hand braced on her elbow. Once she was steady, he let go immediately, stepping back as if he'd crossed an invisible line. "Thank you," she said quietly. He just nodded, turning back toward the barn without another word. That night, cleaning the scrape on her palm by the stove's warmth, she thought about the way he'd looked at her. Like he was looking at a ghost he recognized, but couldn't name aloud. He kept his distance not out of disdain, but out of something that felt dangerously like fear or guilt. May had known many kinds of silence in her life. Caleb's was different, and she couldn't help but wonder what it was he was so afraid to say. It started as a whisper. Red Callahan, a brash young hand with a cruel tongue, had ridden into town for supplies. He returned with flour and beans, but his mouth was heavier still. He waited until supper, when the men were full and warm. "I've seen her before," he said, nodding toward the cookhouse where May worked in solitude. "In Billings, at the Rosebell." The name settled over the camp like ash. Everyone knew the Rosebell, a brothel masquerading as a saloon, a place of velvet curtains and cheap whiskey. Red grinned, his teeth yellow in the firelight. "Wore an apron then, too. Cook, sure. But we all know how those girls get pulled upstairs when the whiskey runs low." A few men chuckled, some uneasily, others with the cruel ease born of long, bitter winters. The poison took root. May didn't hear the words, but she felt them the next morning. The men filed in for breakfast with their eyes downcast. The usual clatter of forks and mugs was muted. They were still polite, but they were no longer kind. They were strangers again. She stirred the beans, her shoulders tight. She sliced the bacon, her hands moving in their familiar rhythm. She had learned long ago that to defend herself was to appear guilty, so she said nothing. Let them talk. She had survived worse. Caleb had heard it too. He hadn't laughed. He'd simply stared into the fire, his jaw set like stone. That afternoon, when Red made another crude joke, something about leftover stew and leftover girls, Caleb moved. There was no warning, no raised voice, just a single hard punch that cracked against Red's jaw with the sound of splitting wood. Red hit the ground, spitting blood. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he sputtered. Caleb stood over him, fists clenched, chest heaving. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, not looking at anyone, least of all May, who had seen it all from the shadows of the cookhouse door. That night, the snow began again, soft and steady. May sat by the banked stove, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. She didn't know what to make of it. Pity? Guilt? Something else she dared not name? The knock, when it came, was so soft she almost missed it. She opened the door to find only the falling snow and a small basket on the stoop. Inside were a dozen brown eggs, still warm from the hen, and a sack of cornmeal tied with rough twine. No note. But she knew. The eggs were from the roost near the barn, Caleb's chore. The cornmeal was from the general store in town. She knelt in the doorway, brushing a snowflake from the basket. For the first time in days, a small, fragile smile touched her lips. She didn't understand him, not yet. But tonight, someone had remembered her worth, quietly, without demand, and that was enough. The fire had long gone out in the bunkhouse, but Caleb could not sleep. He lay on his cot, staring into the dark, the memory burning like a brand in his chest. 3 years ago, the Rosebell. He had gone with friends, loud with whiskey and youth. He remembered the heavy perfume, the stale air, and her. She moved through the chaos with a quiet focus, trying not to be seen. Then she slipped. The tray crashed. An older man, a merchant with a florid face, had roared at her while calling her a filthy tramp. Another had yanked the strings of her apron, and he remembered her eyes. No tears, just a defiant fire. And he, Caleb, had stood there, his fists clenched in his pockets, a coward. The same woman who now rose in the dark to feed men who wouldn't meet her gaze. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, the floorboards cold beneath his feet. Pulling on his coat, He stepped out into the swirling snow and walked to the cookhouse. A dim light still glowed from within. He set a bundle of dry kindling on her stoop. No knock, but this time, he didn't walk away. He stepped into the shadows of a wild rose bush near the wall and watched through a gap in the canvas curtain. She sat by the stove, mending a tear in her work shirt, her brow furrowed in concentration. There was a dignity in her stillness that shamed him. In her, he saw all the courage he had lacked. He had stood by once. He would not do it again. Inside, May paused her needlework. She remembered him too. A face in the crowd that night in Billings. A silent witness. She hadn't hated him, not exactly. But she resented the flicker of foolish hope that someone, anyone, might speak up. And now, here at Stone River, it was this same silent man who chopped her extra wood, who left gifts on her doorstep. He never spoke of that night, but his actions were a long, slow apology. The fire came later that night. A sudden gust of wind swept an ember from the stovepipe into a pile of dry timber stacked too close to the cookhouse wall. Flames roared up the dry wood with a furious crackle. Shouts tore through the night as men scrambled from the bunkhouse. May, exhausted, had fallen asleep on her cot and didn't stir. But Caleb was already moving. He crashed through the door into a wall of smoke, wrapped his coat around her, and lifted her into his arms. He turned his back to the flames, feeling the heat sear through the wool, sparks catching on his sleeves as he carried her out into the snow. She awoke coughing, her face pressed against his chest. Her eyes fluttered open to find his face raw and stark in the fire's chaotic light. He looked down at her, and in that gaze there was no past, no saloon, no shame. There was only the here and now. The woman he had once failed, and the woman he would not fail again. The days that followed grew colder still, the snow packing deep over the hills, and a new ritual was born. Each morning, before the bunkhouse stirred, Caleb would come to the cookhouse. He'd mumble something about needing coffee, but May knew. His eyes always drifted to the small black kettle she now kept on the back of the stove, filled with leftover soup from the night before. He never asked for it. She never offered. But every morning, a warm bowl was waiting on the edge of the table, a silent communion in the heart of the winter. Each time he entered, his hand would pause in the air for a breath, a silent hesitation, before curling around the warm curve of the tin cup she had filled only moments before. Huh. It was the only acknowledgement he ever gave. He never offered a word of thanks. She never mentioned that the coffee had been waiting, poured before the sound of his boots ever reached the porch. It was a strange sort of peace they shared, unspoken, but deeply felt. Tucked beneath the flour sacks, May had started keeping a small ledger. It wasn't for numbers, but for memories. With her own calloused hands, she was slowly transcribing the fading script of her mother's handwriting, copying it from scraps of old linen into neat, determined lines. These were more than recipes. They were incantations. Cornbread without sugar, a memory of leaner times. Beef stew, thick with root vegetables, a promise of warmth against the cold. Molasses pudding, so dense it could anchor a restless cowboy to his chair. They were dreams, really. Dreams of a little place of her own, one day. A kitchen without stairs to climb, and a sign out front that said welcome, and truly meant it. She was stirring a pot of shimmering onion broth when Caleb stepped in again, his shoulders dusted with fresh snow. "Coffee's hot," she said, her eyes fixed on the pot. He nodded, moving toward the counter where the tin cup sat waiting, a delicate curl of steam rising from its rim. He took a quiet sip. After a moment, she asked without turning, "What did you used to think I was?" He paused, the cup held midway to his lips. He set it down slowly on the wood. "I thought you were strong," he said. "Even that first time I saw you, at the bell, you didn't flinch." Her hand stopped stirring. He added, his voice quieter now, "But I also thought I was afraid." "Of me?" she asked, the question soft. "Of myself," he confessed. "Afraid of what it said about me, that I just stood there and watched. Afraid I was no better than the men who laughed." The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was heavy, weighted with unspoken history. Then he said, "I've thought of that night, every day since." She finally turned, and her eyes found his. "Why tell me now?" "Because I owe you more than soup and split wood." May stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is this what you do? Carry guilt around and hope it turns into redemption?" Caleb winced. "I don't know what I'm doing. I just know I want to be something better than I was." She studied him then, this man who had become less of a mystery and more of a question. Perhaps that was why she asked, gently, "So who are you now, really?" He hesitated, then let out a slow breath. "I am Caleb Stone." May blinked. "Stone? As in the Stone River Ranch?" He nodded. "My father owns it. I was raised here, but I left after the war. I only came back last spring. I asked him not to tell the men who I was. I wanted to work for my place, not be handed something I didn't earn." May's face went perfectly still. "So all this time," she said, her voice low and tight, "you've been watching from behind a mask." "No," he said, stepping closer. "I've been trying to earn your truth with mine." She shook her head, taking a step back. "You men, you all wear faces. You pretend to be better than the last one, but you're still just watching, still deciding what a woman is worth based on her past." "Not you," Caleb insisted. Her breath hitched. "Then why lie?" "I didn't lie," he said softly. "I just didn't lead with a name that never fed a horse or built a fire." She looked away, toward the window. The snow had stopped, but the cold seemed to press closer against the glass. May turned back to the stove and stirred the soup once more. Caleb waited. Finally, she ladled a serving into a bowl and set it on the table. "It's hotter than before," she said, "but it cools fast." He sat down slowly and took the spoon in his hand. With a gentleness she hadn't expected, he said, "So do most things worth waiting for." May said nothing, but she did not leave the room, and she did not turn away. The dawn was just a pale smear across the snow, barely breaking the long shadow of the ridge, when May packed her things. Her hands moved in practiced silence, folding her one spare apron, tying a scarf around her hair. The leather-bound cookbook was tucked securely beneath her arm. She left the fire untended, its coals cold and gray from the night before. The crunch of her boots on the frozen earth was the only sound in a world holding its breath. The bunkhouse was quiet. Even the horses had not yet begun their restless stamping. There was only the wind, whispering like regret. May paused by the cookhouse door, her gaze sweeping the empty porch where Caleb sometimes stood before sunrise, pretending to sip his coffee. There was no sign of him. She let out a slow breath. Her heart didn't ache. It burned, a searing pain, like something being torn from the bone. Inside, the shelves still held her jars of pickled onions and her spices wrapped in waxed paper. A loaf of bread sat on the counter, cooling too slowly to matter. But it was not hers. It never had been. This had always been someone else's ranch, someone else's fire. She left her key, a bent nail on a string, hooked beside the stove, and walked away. Caleb did not sleep that night. The snow had started again, a dry, restless fall of thin flurries that caught in his hair and melted down his collar. He stood outside the dark cookhouse for hours, watching the smokeless chimney, the still, silent windows. He had said nothing when she left, not because he didn't want to stop her, but because he knew how many men had tried to trap her with soft words. He would not be another. So instead, he stayed awake, hollowed out by the silence, thinking of everything he should have said and never had. The fire in his chest wasn't just guilt. It was the profound ache of a man who had come too late with too little. When the snow thickened, he finally went inside. He sat at the narrow table her hands had scrubbed clean each morning and reached for the old book she always kept near the flour sacks. Her mother's recipes. Her dream. He hesitated, then tore a blank page from the back and began to write. The letter was short, but it cost him more than anything he had ever spoken aloud. If I were someone else, if time could be rewound like a reel of thread, I would be the man who knelt to wipe that floor for you, not the man who watched and turned away. You stood taller than I ever have. You still do. I do not ask you to forgive me, only to know this. When you stepped into my fire, it was the first time I felt warm. Caleb. He folded the note carefully, slid it inside the front cover of her cookbook, and left it on the edge of the kitchen table, where she would not miss it, if she ever came back. But he did not expect her to. Not after everything. May found the letter on the third night. She had made it only as far as the boarding house in town, her savings just enough for 1 week's cot and cold tea. The cookbook had been tucked in her bag, unread and unopened until now. She had been trying to scribble a new soup recipe on the last page when she felt the thin edge of paper slide free. She unfolded it slowly. She read it once and then a second time. Then she pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. Outside, the wind shrieked against the thin window panes, a storm without end. But inside her, something hardened and frozen began to soften. Not the pain. That would take time. But the belief that maybe, just maybe, not every man was too late. Some just needed a fire they could not ignore. The sun spilled gold over the Montana plains, soft and slow, warming the wood beams of a small building nestled beside the old cattle trail, a trail now leading to something gentler. A carved sign swayed in the breeze above the door. May's table. The front porch was wide, with benches where old cowboys smoked their pipes and children giggled over biscuits and jam. Inside, the air always smelled of cinnamon and smoked pork. The walls held shelves of books and gleaming jars of preserves. A fresh pie sat on the long wooden counter every morning, and behind it, always, was May. Her hands were firm, her laughter easy now. She no longer flinched at raised voices or the heavy tread of boots. She wore her apron with pride and kept a painted tin by the window labeled Dreams, where she taught local girls to save what little they had for something that mattered. Outside, Caleb worked in the herb garden, his sleeves rolled up, his hands dark with soil. He spoke to the basil like an old friend and trimmed the tomatoes with the patient care of a man who knew what it meant to start over. He still didn't speak much, but when he looked at May, his gaze was clear, without shame or shadow. Every Saturday, children from the village gathered by the back door. May taught them how to knead dough, how to tell when oil was too hot, and how to laugh when flour landed in their hair. She told stories while she stirred the stew and never once mentioned the past, unless someone asked. Sometimes, a traveler, catching wind of the place, would lean across the counter and ask, "Ma'am, you sure do cook like you've been doing this forever. Where'd you learn?" May would wipe her hands on her apron, glance over at Caleb as he sliced onions behind her, and smile. "I used to cook for drunks who never knew my name," she'd say. "But now I cook for a man who looks me in the eye." And that was enough. No one ever asked again. Their wedding was a small, quiet affair. They stood in a meadow lit by the late spring sun, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. May wore a simple dress of cream linen she had sewn herself, tied with a blue ribbon Caleb had found in an old drawer. He wore his best shirt and his quiet smile. They stood beneath a crooked oak tree with 2 witnesses and a preacher who barely cleared his throat. But one moment lingered longer than any sermon. At the end, Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. Not lace or silk, just soft, worn cotton, embroidered with a single word in faded red thread. Forgiven. He tied it gently around May's wrist, a silent vow more binding than any spoken word. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with something that had nothing to do with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "No," he said. "Thank you for staying when I gave you every reason not to." They turned together toward the trail, hand in hand, the sunlight catching the embroidery on her wrist. They had no need to run anymore. They had built something that could not be burned, not by fire, not by shame, not even by memory. And that was the beginning of everything. Thank you for joining us on this journey, through the smoke of old kitchens, the silence of regret, and the quiet grace of redemption. May and Caleb's story reminds us that the past does not define who we are, but what we choose to become. That love, real love, does not ask for perfection, only truth and the courage to stand beside it. If this story moved you, there are more waiting in the wild. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for unforgettable tales of grit, passion, and second chances. Set in a land where the wind speaks of old scars and every heart has a frontier. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and ride with us, where love ain't always pretty, but it's always worth it.